to the second annual event of the Five Town One Book series. We're so thankful to have you all here with us tonight, and also to everybody at home on Zoom. Before we get started, I just have a couple of announcements to make. I want to thank the Westchester County Board of Legislators for funding this event, especially Catherine Parker, who has consistently been a great supporter of the work that CURE does. This year, we have partnered with LMC Media, who is here bringing this to you in your homes and recording it for us so we can watch it over and over again if you want to. And also we have partnered with the Westchester Library System and the Westchester Human Rights Commission. We are so grateful to be working again for the second year now with the 5 libraries of Mamaroneck, where we are now, Larchmont, Mamaroneck, Harrison, Rye, and New Rochelle. And tonight I want to specifically thank Jennifer O'Neill from this beautiful Mamaroneck library and her team, Jack, Anthony, Trish, and Linda for making this event happen. So thank you so much to all of you. And this year, it's very exciting. We have 20 additional county libraries that have signed up to promote the Sum of Us and this event series, but also beyond that, will be participating in their own truth, racial healing, and transformation work, which is inspired by Heather McGhee's book. So with that said, tonight's discussion focuses on Chapter 9, The Hidden Wound, in which Heather McGhee discusses the moral suffering caused by racism and how whiteness or white supremacy costs us all. I'm just going to start with a quote from Miss McGhee, which is, "For white people to free themselves from the debt of responsibility for racism, past and present, would be liberating. But there isn't an established route for redemption. America hasn't had a truth and reconciliation process like other wounded societies have. Instead, it's up to individuals to decide what they need to do in order to be good white people in a white supremacist society, and it's not easy." So I am honored to have these 2 brilliant panelists with us tonight. Cyndi Carnaghi-Collins, who, amongst many other things, is a core trainer and organizer with the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And Heath Pearson, who is assistant professor of cultural anthropology at Georgetown University. And both Heath and Cyndi really have dedicated themselves to examining this issue and working in this area. And rather than do it myself, I'm going to ask each of you if you could just introduce yourselves. I will never do it justice. So just if you could start by telling us sort of who you are, what you do, but most importantly, how you came to focus on structures of white supremacy in this country.
Absolutely. Hello, everyone. Really happy to be here with you. Thanks for setting this up. And yeah, so you said a kind of little mini bio on how we got to this work. So I grew up in a town called Marion, Indiana, just a little town in kind of northeastern Indiana. And I grew up in a very, very mixed race neighborhood in Marion, which itself is very mixed race. Neither of my parents went to high school, et cetera, et cetera. So I was in this particular environment, but the kind of unique aspect is that itself was surrounded by exclusively white spaces, like rural 98, 99% white towns. So I had this experience coming up of learning how to navigate, mixed race spaces and segregated spaces, so to speak, at a very early age. And so how this played out is, my own social life from a little kid on was navigating spaces that were very different and diverse. And then the kind of like familial connections were hyper segregated, exclusively white, that is to say. And so I had this weird attunement as a little kid to these kinds of things. So, that led through a whole bunch of different things, which I won't get into tonight, but at one point, I flunked out of college, partly pertaining to this, and I had 7 years where I was just working in factories, working in landscaping, working in all these random things. This has a point, I promise. And what happened is I fell in with a group of people who were attempting to live differently in the place that we were, which I was at that point back in Indiana, still in Indiana. And so it tuned me into working in a space where it was what's going on in the context of this town and what is being reproduced that's creating systems of domination or creating inequitable outcomes, or however we want to kind of think of that. And so through this work, it became, we started a free laundromat, then we started a free meal program, then we started doing all these things, all with no like oversight or regulation of any kind. And so we were building this like little socialist thing in Indiana. We didn't know it was socialist. It was, we were too kind of dumb to understand what we were doing, really. And along the way, I got someone came to me and said, we heard about what happened with you in college a long time ago. We'd like you to go back if you want. And so these people paid for me to go back to school. And that just, it opened up this, it was like a gate where I just couldn't stop reading. I couldn't stop going to the library. It was just this wild transition in my life. And at that time, I came into contact with 2 books, one of which is mentioned at the very beginning of this chapter, which is by Eduardo Bonilla Silva. It's called Racism Without Racists. And I read that book, and it was like for the first time I understood my experience in the world, and a lot of experiences that I feel like I had witnessed that suddenly made sense in some way. And then I read another book on the history of kind of white formation. And so I decided I was going to move somewhere and study full time and get my PhD and all this kind of stuff. And just as I was packing up my Indiana life to do that, a person who I'm closest to in my family was arrested and charged with 2 felonies. And so in that moment, all of this work that I had been doing suddenly like all concentrated and shifted towards prisons. And so I entered New Jersey, both entering into a kind of academic space that was like nothing I had been in before, and then organizing on the ground in New Jersey, specifically against solitary confinement in prisons and against police departments and the many of the practices that they were engaging in. And I will say 2 years ago, one of my closest friends is still organizing. Solitary confinement is now illegal in New Jersey. So that campaign started 20 years ago. And so at that point, then my entire formation in the university system was merged with studying whiteness, white supremacy, the histories of whiteness, and the kinds of like nation states and technologies that are a part of that, and then doing work specifically on the ground. And so those 2 things happened to me simultaneously through this very intimate personal experience. And that's, there's a lot of other things in there, but that's how I came to this.
So I just want to say, first and foremost, thank you to Heath. I just learned that we actually have a lot in common. We should probably talk after this a little bit more than I thought before. So I'll also say that it's really amazing to be here physically in person with you all and to see your faces, your beautiful smiles. There's something about talking about race and talking about racism and white supremacy that feels even more disconnecting when we're not together. Kind of the nature of whiteness is to keep us separate, right? To keep us disconnected. And COVID has certainly done that. But so this is really a beautiful thing for me. And so I just want to thank you for having us and having me in particular. So thank you. So my name is Cyndi, Carnaghi-Collins. I know some of you in the room, which is really, really cool. And I'm certainly hopeful. I know some folks on the webcast as well. I hope some folks are watching. So I grew up here in Westchester County. I'm a Westchester County kid. I actually was born in Atlanta, Georgia, outside of Atlanta, and moved here when I was, I don't know, 6 or 7 years old. Grew up in White Plains, went to White Plains High School. My husband did as well. So did my brother, my mother, my grandmother. So we are really deeply rooted here, but I didn't stay in Westchester forever. So I've had the opportunity, similar to Heath's story, to travel and to be with people. And so the story of becoming, self-aware, aware of whiteness, aware of the race construct in the United States started really young for me. I love people. And so for me, I'm really attuned to people, and I can I feel people at a really deep level, always have, right? I was a really emotional kid. I was an emotional teenager. Not that we all aren't emotional as our teenagers, right? But it was really in attunement to folks' experience. I love to learn about people. I love to be in those relationships. So I would say that actually started my journey, right? There's something special about being able to do that. And what I noticed was from a young age that there were folks that I really connected with and folks that I really struggled to connect with. And I'd always wondered for me what that was about. What was it that disconnected us? That we couldn't get past in order to really be in solidarity and relationship. So I would say that my process of really understanding and starting to be more aware socially of what was happening around me happened in my undergrad, right? I was living in a place called Pembroke, North Carolina. And Pembroke, North Carolina is exit 17 off of 95. It's about 45 minutes from Myrtle Beach. And it's a community that's predominantly indigenous, right? There's a community of indigenous folks down there, the Lumbee tribe, who had been for many, many years petitioning the United States government for tribe status, right? So they were trying to achieve tribe status. And for many, many years, for generations, they were denied. And I witnessed and watched this real interesting split between the poor white community in this part of North Carolina and this indigenous community who had lived there and for generations, right? This was their home, their land. And I started to really question what I was seeing. I wasn't sure what I was seeing, but there were some real questions for me. And so that really started to spark me to really think about things in a different way and think about the world differently. I found myself after that in a place called Erie, Pennsylvania. And if anyone knows Erie, Pennsylvania, it's one of the places I love the most in the entire country. And I've been a lot of places. Interesting community. It was an old factory town, old steel mills. Folks, are in manufacturing, and very, very interesting community because the divestment and the disinvestment from our manufacturing has caused a lot of poverty there, but mostly white poverty. Although those folks have now fled the city, and it's predominantly, it's a split, right? And so living and working in that community gave me a perspective on, similarly to what I experienced in North Carolina, was like, what do white folks experiencing when they experience poverty? And how is that different than the way that folks of color do? And so that began this real intense journey. Now I'm a social worker, and I find myself at NYU as a graduate student. And I stumble into a room similar to this, only all the chairs were in a circle. And this was the moment I think my life shifted. I met David Billings and his wife, Marjorie Freeman, from the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. David invited me into this training, the Undoing Racism workshop, right? Undoing Racism / community organizing. And it finally gave me a framework to understand the things I had been seeing and feeling from when I was a young child. Interestingly, similar to Heath, I also have someone close to me who was incarcerated and who had a lot of interaction with the prison system. And I always wondered why his experience as a white man was very different than the people he met while he was incarcerated. And so the framework the Institute gave me a ground, a foundation to jump off of, to really think about these things critically. So it started my journey. I'm a community organizer. I'm a social worker. I'm a person who values people. Right now, a lot of my work is around human solidarity. And what does it mean for white folks to really start to reinvest in their own humanity in a way that allows us to be more than just white? And so that's what brings me here today. I do this out of a love for myself and my people and my community and each of you. And I just really feel honored to be able to share this space with you and talk about this journey and talk about this beautiful book. So thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. So I'm gonna move now to a moderated kind of portion of the discussion. And I just wanted to quickly let everybody in the room know we will have time for audience questions towards the end. So hold them and I'll give you time here to answer, to ask them. And also to those of you who are at home, you can feel free at any time during this to type questions into the chat. If you would like to, there is an option as well during the question period. If you raise your hand on the Zoom, and you'll be able to speak into the room, I believe. So that's also an option if you'd like to do that, but just hold your questions to the end. So, all right, here we go. I remember sitting in a small cabin upstate with my good friend Heath about 8 years ago, having a conversation as we do. And in this conversation, Heath used the word whiteness. And I'm white. And it was the first time I'd ever heard that word used. Okay. And it was shocking to me that it was the first time I had ever heard this word used. I have kind of always considered myself to be a progressive person, someone who is non-racist, who is culturally conscious. And in this conversation, it was an awakening to me that perhaps my understanding of race is at best naive and probably more harmful than anything else. And I actually always point to this conversation that we had as like the moment where my journey to understanding the truth really began. And so I thought a great way to start off this discussion tonight would be to start with that very simple question that I asked Heath all those years ago. But I'm going to ask it to Cyndi first. Or you can do what you did earlier, which was they were just having a really great conversation about it. But the question I pose is, what is whiteness?
Yeah. So the reason Heath and I were having a conversation is because I asked Heath, like, how do you like, do you have a succinct answer for that question? Because we could spend hours here with you, right? But what I would say is that whiteness, the way that we understand it, the way that I understand it, is the manifestation, right, of the codified or the codified legal race construct for white folks. So the way that we manifest our own history as white folks in this country, like the way we've come into the legalizing of our racial identity, right? How we manifest that. Now, there's a long history behind how that has happened, and we can spend 2 hours talking about the history of becoming white and how we became white in this country. But I would say that whiteness is the manifestation of that history, right? And how that's become legalized for white folks. And there is a difference between whiteness and white people. And we can talk about that a little bit. We've definitely internalized a lot of the cultural aspects of white supremacy in this country as white people, right? It's deep in our groundwater. But for us who have come to be called white, we weren't always that. Like, we were something else before we started to internalize these messages of whiteness and acting out and manifesting them that have been legalized and codified by our systems and institutions. So that was my succinct answer. Heath may have a different succinct answer. So we're going to have a dialogue about this, I think. Yeah. So go ahead.
I don't have a succinct answer, actually. So I can give a non-succinct answer. I won't go too long. I'm going to time myself here. Okay. Okay. So for me, the important thing first is that whiteness, it assumes a power structure, or a hierarchy, we might call it, or a system of domination, or a society structured in domination. And so I just want to give a really quick background here. So 13th century ish. So if we go, let's just go there for 1 second. Well, a little more than 1 second. So if we go back to kind of what's happening in Europe before Europe is Europe, right? We have a whole bunch of things happening all at the same time, right? So we have the economic system is changing, right, from feudalism to capitalism, and that's happening in fits and starts. And the way that land is held and power is distributed is changing. It's moving away from like individual landholders into more nation state type things, or things that would become nation states and or larger kingdoms, things like this. So there's a massive kind of redistribution of people, of land, of resources, these kinds of things. You know, families that had held land forever now have nothing. There's all of these kinds of changes happening. One big thing that's happening is that as feudalism is in this moment of like giving birth to capital, or however we want to think about it, there's a demand for goods that are being traded in much wider spaces, right? So trade routes are globalizing at this point, in other words. And so one of the first things that happens is people who are called barbarians start coming into this region. And we would hear the word barbarians and think that that means people with like fur and swords and fire and like coming in and burning down villages and taking over towns and things like this. But actually, barbarians were the first people who were moving to look explicitly for work that paid. Not that we would have any correlation in our own society of political leaders referring to people who are looking for work as barbaric or barbarians or monsters or, right, anything you want to think about. And so at that moment, barbarians, that is people who are looking for work, and they are coming into this space and becoming relegated to a very, 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 very low position in a kind of budding social order, right? And of course, at the top of this budding social order is people who happen to have white skin, right, at the time. But at this time, that is a lot, really, that doesn't have like play in the sense that it has now, almost 1,000 years later, right? So immediately we have a kind of stratifying action happening that is, it's entangling itself into the budding economy, right? That's happening. Now, while all of this is happening, then we have Christian crusades, right? And that is coming up against, in large part, Black Islamic foreigners, right? So as all of this is happening in Europe, then we have a much wider kind of thing happening where it's like good white Christian forming against Black evil Islam, right? So this is a context. And of course, we know what happens out of that context is that Spain and Portugal and other places that are forming and are powerful at this time, right, and have cohesion to their political state, start going out and occupying land that isn't theirs, right, stealing land on other continents, killing people who live on that land, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, those get brought into this emerging globalizing trade route, right? And we know that then for hundreds of years, the most precious commodity as part of that trade route is people who are stolen from the African continent and sold, right? And then also become reproductive, both in the sense of making more people and working, right? So all of this is a kind of precursor of then what would eventually become the United States, of course, right, happening on North America. So that wider thing, which is a horrible, I hope there are no historians here because you're going to probably like take me to task after this, but this is a very big context, right, that is both entangled ideologically, that is, it's teaching people how to see themselves, how to see the world, how to see their work, how to see power, how to see religion, right? All of these things become entangled with whiteness as good, as Christian, or as God, whatever you want to think of that. And then, of course, the inverse there is happening as well, right? And so So that becomes of an early moment of racial differentiation or racialized differentiation, I should say, that is intimately connected to power and money, right? And so then the United States, of course, has its own kind of version of that, that maybe we're slightly more familiar with. But within that context, then we have, as we know, certain people in the earliest days are white, and then no one else is, right? And then slowly one ethnic group becomes white that wasn't white before. And whiteness as a category changes depending on what the power structure demands for the people who are already in power to maintain that power, right? I think this lines up a little bit with whiteness. And so I think understanding, of course, we can go backwards and talk about antecedents more. We can go forwards and flesh that out more specifically in our kind of like nation state. But I think it's important to hold whiteness not simply as this abstracted thing that exists like in the ether somewhere that we can't touch, but recognizing how whiteness as this constructed thing is entangled up in so many other institutions and structural conditions that remain very much alive, well, and powerful today.
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Like when we're having this dialogue, one of the things that Heath and I were talking about earlier is that like that education. So that was succinct, believe it or not, to do a history lesson from the 13th century, to now in 5 minutes it is succinct. But what I would say is that like, that history is not actually taught to us in any sort of, right. And there's a specific reason for that, right? If we really understood that there was context to sort of not just the ideological sort of, understanding and sort of process of race and whiteness, but that our history is longer, right, than 1865, 1776, even 1790, when the Naturalization Act said that only free white people could be citizens of the United States. Like this is further, we have to think about it in a broader context, but that history isn't taught to us, and it's very, very specific as to why that is. Why might we not learn that history, especially as white folks in the United States? You could yell it out. Why is that functional to the race construct? So that's part of it, right? That we would know that we were barbarians, right? That's part of it. Absolutely. That's a huge part of it. Why else is this functional to the system of the race construct? Why else?
Because if you don't know what it is, you can't change it.
Right. And we can't not just change it, but we also can't reconcile our history. Like, right. So if we can really understand it, then we are dumbed down to white supremacy as an action and not white supremacy as an internalized way of being, right? Historically, right? And so when we're thinking about this from a community standpoint, as we're having these dialogues outside of forums like this, how do we articulate that in a way that folks really can absorb, understand? That's community organizing, right? Mm-hmm. And so as we're having this dialogue, it's important for me to point out and for us to point out that this process is a process of understanding more than it is sort of just talking about it, right? It's important.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'm very impressed with that 5-minute long world history lesson. So I want to move on a little bit to talk about the implications of this concept of whiteness. And the title of the chapter that we're discussing tonight is The Hidden Wound, which is also the title of Wendell Berry's poignant essay written in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement about really the suffering that racism causes white people. And Berry, I just want to read the closing paragraph of this essay, which is, it is not, I think, a question of when and how the white people will free the Black and the red people. It is a condescension to believe that we have the power to do that. Until we have recognized in them the full strength and grace of their distinctive humanity, we will be able to set no one free, for we will not be free ourselves. When we realize that they possess a knowledge for the lack of which we are incomplete and in pain, then the wound in our history will be healed. Then they will simply be free among us, and so will we among ourselves for the first time and among them. And so Heath, actually, where you grew up in Indiana is really close to where Wendell Berry grew up in Kentucky. I think both in terms of distance and culturally in a lot of ways. And you both are white men, although of different generations. But I would love for you to tell us how you think about the costs of whiteness and who bears these costs. I know it's a big question.
Yeah.
Whatever is you think that, the first kind of thing that comes to your mind.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think we all bear the costs. So, I think for me, I think about exactly going back to that history, because I think in situating myself in a history like that, it enables a kind of both one, I think, knowing the history and sitting with and in that history in and of itself is a very significant activity and work to do. But I also think that that's, it's also how is this entangled and related in such a way that I'm caught up in this, both in ways that I'm conscious of because of work that I've done, because of relationships that I've had my whole life, because of this, that, and the other. But also all of those ways in which I don't see the ways that I'm caught up. I don't see the ways in which I'm reproducing actions that I don't want to reproduce, that I'm participating in supporting systems and institutions and organizations that are reproducing, say, white supremacy, or however we want to think about this, in ways that I really don't want to be. And so in some sense, I think, the cost, I think it's I think it was Toni Morrison that said, one of the biggest things is it's just such a distraction. It takes so much time and energy and effort from daily life, from minute life, from thinking, from feeling, from all of these things. And so in one sense, I think there's this really, really intense and real embodied cost that, because of our own entanglement in this system, we are alienated from ourselves. We are alienated from our history, and we're alienated from the people that we're around, whether it's other white people or whether it's non-white people, or whether it's, I think the amount of alienation that's a part of what whiteness has accomplished and continues to reproduce is something, at least from my perspective, that expands beyond our capacity to kind of understand this level of alienation. And so that is a massive cost. And I mean, I think that kind of cost, that is in everything that we're a part of in some sense. And so, for me, I think a lot about that alienation and what it is that's reproducing, and then how that warps my relationship with myself, my relationship with my partner, my relationship in my neighborhood and in my town and in my class. And, so I think these things have a way of kind of spiraling and rippling out, where suddenly you realize that thing it manifests everywhere, in that sense. And so it's hard to like narrow it down to a cost. But I think one of the costs that I am most concerned with, both in building relationships and doing the work to attempt to move away from alienation every day, and then how that ripples out. That's not in any way the only cost, but I think that is a major cost.
Yeah, I so appreciate you talking about alienation, because I 100% agree. I think that and I want to just acknowledge that as human beings, white folks are not a monolith, right? And nor are folks of color, right? We don't say that, I wouldn't be generalizing, right, the experiences of all of us. But what I would say is that what a hallmark of being socialized into white supremacy is that disconnect that Heath talks about, that inability to be self-reflective, our inability to see self. It's, a good friend of mine in the Soul Focus group, Martin Friedman, talks about this concept like of vampire syndrome for white folks. And so the deal with vampires is they often operate in the world as almost like in a zombie-like state, right? They're not necessarily present to this world. They're not fully alive, right? They're not fully seeing the world. They can only go out at night, right? That they're limited, that they require the lifeblood of others to survive. And when they look into the mirror, they don't see themselves, because vampires don't see themselves. And that's generally, if we talk about the cost of whiteness for white people. And so I'm going to stay focused on white folks because I'm white and I'm talking to some white folks, right? Although I know there's folks of color in the audience. Our inability to see ourselves and be able to do self-reflection, see that history that Heath talked about, to be able to do that spiritual work that is demanded of us in order to reconnect with our humanity, in order to live a more humane life. That is, for me, the thing that I see when I go into white communities all over the country, that there's manifestations of rage, paranoia, deep anxiety, neuroses, pathology, pain, suffering. And what I attribute that to is that whiteness has stripped us so much of the people that we are, that the only thing we have left is whiteness. And so if I was to ask any of the white folks in the audience today, what you like about being white, what might you tell me? What might I hear? What do you like about being white? Like about being white?
I think it's easier for us.
It's easier, right? So there's ease. What else? So when we do this in groups, right, we'll hear things like ease, right? I don't get stopped by the police, right? I have access to good education. I'm not questioned when I stand up in front of a room, right? And so when we talk about this and we say, what do you like about, like, that's all we hear. That's all whiteness is, right? Right, that's what's been internalized. But if I was to ask you what you like about being Irish or Italian or Spanish, right, from Spain, or Portuguese or English, you would tell me a whole bunch of stuff that has real value to it. The stripping of that humanity, the throwing away and asking us to assimilate to whiteness for the purposes of privilege, access, power, it's all well and good, but we left a lot behind too. And what happens when we lose that is that our humanity is so impacted, it's then easy to commit violence, right? And whether it's explicit violence, right, or it's violence in our words, violence in the stealing of culture, right? All those things that happen, it makes that very, very easy for us to do. And that's the alienation for me, is that there's such a disconnect between who we were, who we became, and who we really want to be. So when we do anti-racism work with white people, and I think you have a question on this, so I'm going to actually just ease into this slowly. When we do anti-racist work with white folks, oftentimes it's very externalized, right? The focus is externalized. The focus is on communities of color, right? On folks of color, on the suffering, as it should be, right? That needs to be dealt with immediately, right? The violence against Black and brown bodies. And we never do this work. So our intention may be really good, but our impact is as violent as it was even when we were acting overtly white supremacist. So I just want to hold that's a dynamic, right? That work that we have to do to reconnect with who we were before we became white. Mm-hmm.
Do you want to respond to that at all, Heath, or give you the opportunity to, if you'd like to?
No, I think not right
Thank
now.
you so
Yeah,
much.
yeah.
Go ahead.
I'd like to give you my experience because I think growing up, it kind of gives a big picture. It's not me individually. I grew up in a,
Can I
Sure.
ask that we just,
I'll wait.
if we can wait till.
I'm sorry.
We have
That's
Q&A,
okay.
right?
To
Yep.
the Q&A, I wasn't sure if it was super
Sorry,
relevant just to
you're
that
reaching out
or no, not yet, but we'll definitely get to that. Thank you. So what I would like to do now is just bring this all home a little bit to where we are in this community. So our small community here we're in Mamaroneck, but I think this is true of a lot of communities around Westchester, is that our community is comprised of extreme kind of income and wealth inequality, right? And it's much like the United States as a whole. And in the past 2 years have been extraordinarily, if not catastrophically difficult for so many of our neighbors, many of whom are poor, who are not white, who are immigrants and speak English not as their first language. They have been severely impacted by not only COVID, but also the flooding that we experienced here after Hurricane Ida. There was a lot, I mean, Heath, you're not from around here, but there was a lot of devastation around here. And this is not even to mention the years of difficulty that they underwent during the previous presidential administration's policies. And what we saw during this time really was an incredible outpouring of support from people in this community for those who were vulnerable. I mean, we saw people feeding people, clothing people, housing people, donating money to a myriad different relief efforts. And this is a really great community in that way. And what I would like to talk about now is making that jump from charity, which is not to be disparaged in any way, because as we've seen, it's necessary, and especially in times of crisis, it's crucial. But making that jump from charity to actually building equity within our community. And so I just kind of want to put that out there to both of you, to talk about sort of why it's important for individuals in a community like ours to make that jump. Who wants to go first?
Rock, paper, scissors.
You're the social worker.
Yeah, I am the social worker. Thank you. So look, I mean, I think I think white culture forces us into ways of thinking and being, right? And two of those ways are linear and dichotomous thinking, like that it's either or there's like a point A to point B, and this is the only way we can go, right? So I want to hold that, that charity and giving and ensuring that folks are well cared for is important, right? First of all, there's a reason it's important, because it's just important, right? It's a good gesture. It also creates a situation or a system that shows folks that they're cared for, which helps people heal from things like the trauma that folks are experiencing in communities with flooding and the abuse and the isolation that happened because of immigration policies in this example. So there's a real place for that. But my question is, if you're walking in the woods and you come upon a river and you see a baby floating in the river, I would imagine most of you would dive in, grab the baby and take it out, right? But if you're walking past a river and you see 10 babies floating down the river, you would obviously save the babies, but there's a prevailing question, right? And what's the prevailing question as you see more and more babies floating down the river? Who the heck, who's throwing babies in the river, right? Who's throwing the babies? So I hold that, I want to hold that, right? And because something has to happen upriver, upstream, right? And that's your equity work. Like the upstream work is your equity work. The downstream work is also important because you don't want to lose babies, right? You got to find them places to live, you got to feed them, you got to take care of them. But so in order to stop, and believe it or not, that's a good example because we do have babies floating down the river. We have babies in cages. We have children being removed at disproportionate rates who are Black and brown. We have the deaths of Black men at the hands of police. We have babies floating down the river, and very rarely do we ever go upstream because it's the harder question. It's easier and it makes us feel good that we're taking care of folks, and we should take care of folks. But the harder question, and sometimes the more complex question that calls us into accountability in our actions and how we perpetuate those systems, that's the hard work, right? And so I would say that the both and is really important to live in this both and place and to go upriver to see who's tossing our babies because they're being tossed.
That was really succinct.
That's good. That's the word for tonight.
The word for tonight. Yeah, I mean, I 100% am with you on that. I think, charity is something that I see as immediate and necessary and demanding, and it often stems from something that happens and becomes, an in the moment reaction or action. But it's also important to remember that charity leaves the structure in place, right? So it keeps everything the same. And that is to say, the people at the top are moving down to help people who aren't at the top. And so, as I would say, this has to do with time and how we're thinking about time, I think, a little bit. There's going to be times when you're like, I got to pop this shirt off and jump in the river, right? I got to do that now. I had to do that yesterday. But there's also that work of stepping back from the river and saying, hang on a second, who is reproducing the activity that keeps throwing people into this river? And so that's the work, I think, that we have to think of in two ways. One is we have an incredible amount of work ahead of us that has to be dismantling. There's so much to dismantle in this country alone, in this state, in this county, maybe in this neighborhood. I don't know. I'm not from here, but in my neighborhood where I live in South Baltimore, there's so much work to be done just within 4-block radius of where I live, where me and my family live. And so that dismantling work is highly, highly, highly important. And that's the work that we don't want to talk about the dismantling work, right? Because a lot of what's happening one thing that's happening from that is babies are getting thrown from the river, but there's also all these other things that are happening from that institution that's good for me. So why would I want to dismantle that shit, right? So the dismantling is something that is a lot of work. It's something that necessitates collaboration. It's something that requires attention over a really long period of time. And it's also something that I think we have to be willing to just lose over and over and over again, right? Like I said, and I said this, I wanted to say it this way, New Jersey just got rid of solitary confinement 2 years ago, but people were working on that for 2 decades, right? And it's just solitary, it's one thing in the prison system in one state. And they've already found language to work around it so that they can still do it, right? Of course they have. But still, it is one thing. And there isn't solitary confinement from an official standpoint in New Jersey. And that shit matters. At the very same time, I want to say, of dismantling, there's also the work of building. And that building also has to be deeply and intimately collaborative and in touch with history, with context, and with most specifically the people who make up that context, right? And so I think on the one hand, it's really easy for us sometimes to either jump in the river, or it's really easy for us to see something and say something. Different use of that phrase. what's not easy is to say, you know what, this is going to take like 3 years for me to figure out what's going on here. And I'm going to put in that 3 years, I guess. And actually it takes 7 years and so, it's I think how I would read that is it takes all kinds of perspectives, working on all kinds of timelines through all of those different modes of working.
I mean, that's a tough question. That was awesome. And you actually managed to cue up my next one perfectly. So I guess if charity is good in many instances, but can actually serve to uphold the current system, which is oppressive, what can and should we be doing? And I want to give Cyndi the opportunity also to talk about the really important work you're doing with I'll let you talk with the workshops and everything, but
what should we be doing?
Yes.
How many of you have ever felt lost in this journey where you just didn't know where to go? Raise your hand. So for folks who can't, yeah, me too. So for folks who can't see the audience, I don't know if you can see them. That's basically everybody said yes. They felt lost. It's easy to feel lost, right? Because we are the race construct and the way that the race construct has manifested in the United States, it requires us to feel lost, right? And so the first thing I would say is to acknowledge that race is specious. It looks like it can be real, but it's false science, right? But it has implications for everything that we do, every way that we live, how our babies are raised, how they're born, how healthy they are, where they end up. So race is real. And so, I opened the book up and Heather McGee says, colorblindness has become a powerful weapon against the progress of people of color, but as a denial mindset, it doesn't do white people any favors either. And so many of us have been raised in this society who are white, I would say. I would imagine that folks of color have not been raised colorblind. That's what I've heard as I've spoken to many, many communities. Like white folks are really the ones that are internalizing this colorblind approach. First and foremost is to acknowledge that race is real and racism is real. And to start to become curious about your experience in the United States, your ancestors' experience in the United States. Be curious about how you became who you are today, how this race construct impacts you, how this becomes really about the way that we live our lives. Be conscious, be questioning, be curious, because curiosity is the antidote to conflict in many respects, right? And so as we increase our curiosity, we can really start to do some powerful work. Find yourself some communities that you can really dig into issues of race and racism with that look like the folks that you represent, those of us who have come to be called white. Find yourself a white affinity group. Start digging in, right? Dig in and stay. The stick and stay, as Heath kind of pointed out here, is the piece for white folks, is we got to stick and stay. We have to understand that our humanity is intertwined, right? And that our liberation is required, and the only people who can liberate us is us. We are responsible for our healing from this construct that has dehumanized us so much that we can witness the violence against Black and brown people and almost not even bat an eye. Like that's something to think about. That it's become normalized for us. That's something to think about. And so find yourself some communities. And, so I appreciate you, Gabi, like queuing me up to talk about some of the work, work for multiple organizations doing lots and lots of different types of work, but I want to name the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. Take an Undoing Racism workshop, do the workshop. The Soul Focus Group is another organization I work with that's seeking to really do work around the intersection between social consciousness and spiritual consciousness. How have we become who we are? And how do we start to move through this story of race and racism into a place of human solidarity? How do we do that while acknowledging the impact that race and racism has had on all of us? How do we do that? And so I would just really push everyone to reach out to CURE, reach out to me. I'd be happy to talk to anybody. Really talk about this, dig in, and stick and stay.
Yeah, so I think for me, this really ties into the idea of alienation. As I see it, there are really two aspects that I would think about responding to this question, both revolving around relation building, which is for me how we undo alienation, how we walk away from alienation in a collective sense. But so I think there's a few things I'm just gonna, so, you know, one dimension to this from my perspective has to do with the self and study. And so, you know, we're talking about something here. I just stretched us back to 900 years. You don't have to go that far. Some people started thinking about whiteness in 2016 for obvious reasons, but it has been around longer than that. And so we're talking about something that is almost 1,000 years in the making. It's not going to be untied in a 15-minute book club, right? This is just an aspect. It's a dimension. But so I think setting oneself to study and real study, you know, finding a group of people and studying, reading, researching your own contexts. How did your town come to be what your town is? How did the towns next to your town come to be what those towns are? How did your system of government come into place? All of those things are very regionally distinct spaces, histories, and they're probably all entangled in some way with racial hierarchy. All of those institutions and histories. And so study, in my mind, is a highly important aspect to this. And part of study is that self-work that is necessarily entangled in the work of studying with others, right? So, you know, that's an unending part of it, as I see it, or ongoing, maybe is a better way to say it. That's ongoing, our approach of study. Then the second thing I think is you entangle yourself with other people. So what communities are you a part of? What organizations are you a part of? And what are their aims? You know, who are your friends? Who do you text? Where do you spend your time? Like, where do your kids go to school? There's all of these kinds of things that are you can actually look at, you can touch, you can hear, you can smell, right? It's a sensing reality. And so I think, you know, just to give you like a really an example from my own life. So I work with a group of people. As I said, we worked on solitary confinement. I joined, you know, at 10 years ago. But I work in a few different groups that have like really big ambitions, like ending prisons in this country, for example, is one of our ambitions. But I also write letters back and forth with people who are in prison, right? And I don't see either one of those activities as more important than the other one, right? That is, so I think that this work, it takes on all kinds of different facets and all kinds of level of how we're thinking about what that work is, right? And so I think moving out, the biggest thing to me is that it's study, and it's how are you entangled? That is to say, what are your relationships? Yeah, I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Perfect timing for audience questions. So just as a reminder, or anybody who joined late, in the room, we'll have a microphone. You can raise your hand and we'll bring you one, and you can ask one here. For those of you at home on Zoom, you can either put a question in the chat and somebody in the room here can read it out to us, or use the raise your hand function on Zoom and unmute yourself. Once you've been called on, unmute yourself and your voice will be heard with us in the room. So go ahead. There's someone here.
That's Nicole, everyone. I live in New Rochelle, a community very similar to Mamaroneck, like 2 cities over. And I asked this specific question because it's just a title, but it's concerning. And how can we prosper, right? So when I think about we, because most of this conversation has been directed towards the people who have known to become white. I also took the People's Institute course. And you are prospering. When you ask the question, what does it feel like to be white, right? How does that feel? Ease, right? Because you can't think of anything else because being white is, you know? So when I think about how can we prosper, you are already prospering, acknowledge that. How can we prosper collectively is to make things equitable. The charity work, as was explained, and I'm not speaking for all Black people because we are not all having the same experiences. And I caution dear white people, stop assuming that Black and Latino people are having the same experiences in America, because we are absolutely not. Latino people usually get to go home depending on what state you're in. Black people are getting killed. Black people are being incarcerated. Black people are being ripped from their family intentionally, right? Separate point. But what I wanted to say with this specific caption of this title was, in order to understand how we find ourselves in America, right? I think it's to understand, and as you said, when you do that work on yourselves, is to understand that one, none of us are having the same experiences. Even wealthy Black people are not having the same experiences as wealthy white Americans because they're still Black at the end of the day. But to make things equitable so that you don't have to do the charity work that makes you feel good when you go home, right? To do the commitment, to give the commitment is how we prosper. To not just give me a job, but teach me how to be an entrepreneur. That's how we prosper. To touch my spirit, to touch my soul, because I cannot go back to 1300s and say, this is where I came from. I am already broken to my core, to my spirit, right? So I'm not asking you all to do that work for us, but I'm saying the thing that could make the field, the playing field level is to acknowledge that I don't need you to feel sorry for us, right? I need you to make things equitable, and I really feel like that's the thing outside of, because the racist stuff is the stuff that you really should go home and sit with some friends and talk about, and don't ask Black people to disrobe for you. It's disgusting, and we don't want to. I don't want to tell my horror story to you to make you feel better or to make you want to help me. It is actually disgusting and deplorable. But for you to talk to each other honestly, how you see yourselves in America, how you see yourselves with Black people. Do you have any Black friends? It doesn't necessarily make you a racist, but expand your friend group, right? So in this book, I just wanted to encourage some of that thought for the people that have read the book, for some of the passages that might have touched them, because to continue that, to not get the babies downstream and to figure out why are there 10 babies flowing down here? You know what I mean? That's the work. You need to move upstream sometimes. And you need to move upstream with a sense of urgency, especially now. And I would even say, especially in Mamaroneck, what happened, a little while ago with the flooding, it was absolutely ridiculous, but it was beautiful to see how the community came together. That's how America could look. That's how the world should look, to come together. And now these people who didn't have homes, right? Now some people are being gainfully employed, right? Legally, right? So that's the work that should be done.
All right, so I appreciate what you just said. I am not smart enough to know what to do now. So I'm going to talk about my history and how the path of my success and the people that I grew up was so much different from the path of other people. In the 50s, the government created a lot of affordable housing for returning veterans. There was a 2,000 unit complex that was built in Queens. My family moved there from the Bronx in 1953. Somehow, 99.9% of the people who lived out in community were white and Jewish. And we didn't think anything of it. That was our world. Had no idea what was beyond that community. Except for myself, most of the kids I grew up with became doctors, lawyers, successful businessmen. Not far from my community, in other parts like Jamaica, St. Albans, and of course in the Bronx and Brooklyn, there were affordable housing for minority families. They had crime. We had no crime. The biggest crime was your parents saw you smoking a cigarette. There was no crime. There was no concern about anything. It was a safe community. That certainly cannot be said for the other communities where minorities grew up. And certainly their levels of success were nowhere near the success of the kids that I grew up. And we grew up in lower middle class, but clearly jumped, to the next level. So I have no suggestions for how to make things better now, but I'm just kind of reminding and letting people know how things were back then that kind of paved the way for where some of us are today. Some of us are much more successful, wealthier, because of the way things were done 50, 60 years ago. That's what I say.
I want to thank you for giving us a little bit of that historical context. And if we were going further upstream, we would ask the question, how did systems and institutions lead to the uptick in what we identified here as crime and the downfall of specific communities over others, right? So what systems and institutions at that time were leading to that? We had redlining, right? We had the system of insuring communities, right? Even earlier than that. And so there's these setups that happen for communities that set us up that are beyond what you just mentioned, right? That are earlier than that period that lead us to where we are today. So what we would say is like that history is really important and we need to hold that history. And then we need to take it a step further backwards, right? And then another step further, because it isn't in a 10 to 20 to 30 year period that communities experience oppression, right? That is a historical setup. And so we would ask that's a really good example of a disconnect, right? And we would say, keep going backwards, right? Keep going backwards. And as Heath talked about, study, right? Think about the way that those communities were set up to be experienced that way. And then the way that that socialization about those communities seeped into our groundwater and have us think about those communities today.
It just seems to me you're so far back, you're asking people to go,
Mhm.
even though there's a huge history to it. But what Robert said, I would tell you that most average folks don't even know what happened in housing.
Mhm.
Don't even
That's
know
right.
what happened, kids of the 50s
That's right.
who were, had advantages that other kids didn't have.
Sure.
And I just would like more activities that are possible to do today versus studying our history.
Sure. Sure. Well, we don't think that history is disconnected from our present, right? And that part of the reason why white supremacy exists in the United, that's a great point. And I hear that a lot. But the reason that white supremacy persists today is because we take a historical approach to understanding our current situation. And oftentimes the things that we see occurring today have already happened 3 times prior. And if we could have understood that history, we could have anticipated the way that the imposition of oppression would be occurring today. And that's why I said earlier that the race construct and racism demands and requires us to be ahistorical, like to not know any of that history. It demands that. It also demands colorblindness, but those two things hand in hand, right? And so we say study the history so that we can anticipate and really think about the way that we can interrupt some of these systems of oppression today. I don't know if you have an answer to that.
No, that's
Okay.
Yeah, I think we're going to go from our Zoom audience for the next question. Yeah. Okay, go ahead, Joan. Joan, can you unmute yourself, please? Come to the principal's office.
Please move to the back of the airplane. Please place your luggage. Did you see what it said?
Yes, hi, this is Bruce. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Hi, yeah, it says Lourdes, but Lourdes and I are partners. One of the really powerful ideas in this book for me was the question she asks early in the book, which is, why can't we have nice things? And, she goes through the fact that we're a wealthy society without a national healthcare system, without childcare, without elder care, and without, just so many things that other countries similarly situated take for granted. And she really identifies racism as one of the major reasons why we don't have, I wouldn't call them nice things, I'd call them basic things in this country. And it resonates for me with what he said, quoting Toni Morrison, about racism is a distraction. And we have such a perfect example of it now on the heels of a social movement and a sort of sputtering progressive agenda in the country, to have all of a sudden critical race theory thrown out there, which nobody ever heard of 2 years ago, and now everybody's fighting over, rather than really putting our wheels, our shoulders to the wheels, and fighting for some real meaningful changes in this country, which obviously we really need. So my question really, and I want to direct it to Cyndi primarily, is do you also see this as this conversation as a powerful organizing tool among white people, and where does it fit into the sort of broader argument about whiteness that you and Heath have been putting forward?
It is absolutely, it's absolutely an organizing tool. If I heard your question correctly, there's a little bit of static. And this idea that why can't we have nice things? One of the ways that we can look at this is I've lived and worked in poor white community and seen poor white communities. And what I'll say is that, like, racism is so deep for white folks that we'll vote against our own political interests over and over again on the basis of race. And we never, and we don't have social mobility, not fully, right? We still live in squalor, in places where we don't have running water, right? In situations that I couldn't even imagine. I never understood rural poverty until I started to experience that. Yet we will use yet race is used, right, as the tool to keep us in a divided state. And that's historic. We can go back to to colonial, right, to the colonial system, and understanding the way that was set up to ensure that poor people of many, many different ethnic and national backgrounds, including the poor and indentured African folks and enslaved folks, right? The way that the race construct was used to divide those folks so that we couldn't come together against the aristocracy, right? The way that's to keep us apart, right? To keep us from really addressing our social situation together. So the reality is that this has to be part of the dialogue, right? And so when you say prosper together, that's what we're talking about, right? And how do we create systems and relationships, right, that really do address what Heather McGee talks about as, having nice things, right? Because poor white folks are not doing all that well. They're doing better than folks of color, but they're not doing that well, right? Yet we continue to vote against our own political interests and our best interests on the basis of race. So it has to be part of the conversation, in my opinion.
Yeah, and I think that one thing we haven't really touched on is, or I haven't touched on it maybe much, is the entanglement of racism / white supremacy with getting rid of real taxes. I mean, the tax system in this country is bonkers, right?
Yeah.
Like, public service, even just to give one example, this isn't relevant to anyone, but I was at Michigan for a couple of years, and I had my students do some work on Michigan, what it costs to go to Michigan in-state, out-of-state this would have been 2020, and what both of those things cost in 1975. And so one thing that came up, not only, obviously there's this massive, you could go to University of Michigan for about $500 a semester in 1975. However, does anyone want to take a guess on how much of the university's budget was covered by state taxes in 1975, just off the top of your head?
75%.
Oh,
I made that up.
74%. Does anybody want to take, or 78%? You were close, but what does anybody want to take a guess what it is today? 14.
That's crazy. It's insane.
14%. And that's across the board, right? Like look at the UC system, look at any state system. That's just public schools. We can go down the list of public services, right? What we should just call standard, what should be standard. But why can't we have nice things? Well, because people are hoarding all of the money and not paying taxes. That's why. I mean, and that is deeply rooted and embedded in racism. And specifically how social programs came to be services that were perceived, even a social program, quote unquote, like the US Postal Service, right? It's not coincidental that the conservatives have been trying to dismantle the Postal Service for 4 decades. That is one of the public institutions that Black folks got jobs and moved into the middle class going all the way back about 5 decades. I'm just using this as one example, not holding it up as the whole thing. But that's just to say that this is part of the study, right? And so I think, you know, when we look at those things, we have to be willing to look at what that's a big reason we don't have nice things, so to speak.
And just to bring it back to, I agree. And just to bring it back to Heather McGee, you know, the way she sort of sets up the premise of the sum of us is that we've come to understand things as a zero-sum game, when in fact, that's not the way it is or has to be. But we kind of govern ourselves, our economy, our political institutions by, if you get or you have, then by definition, it's taking from me, as opposed to kind of building a bigger pie for everyone. But we have time for one more question because we are getting close to the end. Or
question, and I'm asking of all of you, would you consider the sum of us to be part of critical race theory?
But I'm gonna let Heath take the lead on this one. Sorry, Heath, I'm gonna kick it over to you.
So I have not read the whole book. I make my students tell me how much of the book they read at the beginning of class. I would say it's more a focus on equity and how that's tied into race, that is using a lot of people who would consider themselves critical race theorists, scholars, academics, whatever, thinkers, intellectuals, blah, 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 blah. She's bringing these in and using them throughout, but I wouldn't call this a theoretical work in that sense.
okay, one more question.
Is that okay? Okay.
Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. My question is, when we start beginning to talk about equity, I would like to know, how can you plan on equity? Because equity cannot be equal. Because the moderator talks about immigrants and equity for immigrants, but how can we discuss equity when, to quote, and I have read all of the book, to quote Ms. McGee, Black people were the birds in the cage for everything that has been done to everybody. So if we're going to talk about building equity, what is the plan for equity for Black people? Because it's not, if we build any plan that does not give Black people equity, commiserate with the years of enslavement, Jim Crow, and just racial discrimination, which the gentleman talked about when we talked about public housing. And I'm from New Rochelle, grew up in New Rochelle. So I know quite a bit about what happened to the Black community in New Rochelle when they put Memorial Highway through. What kind of plan can we have? What do you envision seeing? Because if everybody comes around and they start talking about equity, and how are we gonna, and maybe that's where I'm lost. I'm not lost when it comes to talking about race. And I think it's great that you talk about white people need to talk to white people. But when it comes to talking about equity and making sure that people become really have equity in the system, how is that going to happen for Black people?
Really quickly here, and just thank you so much for that question, and also just to kind of apologize and clarify that in asking the question the way that I did, I may have insinuated that I was only kind of referring to a certain population, but I absolutely agree with you that the equity question is incredibly, I mean, it's so important in terms of Black people and their history in this country. So I just want to clarify that my intention was not to exclude them from that question. I think it was just the way the question was phrased. So I just want to clarify that, and thank you for the question. And then
this is not going to be this is going to be a tough answer to that really incredibly hard question.
Yeah.
Because what I would say is that I can't answer that. I can't answer that because I don't know what community, what folks of color, and particularly Black folks, need in order for folks to experience what it means to prosper, as one of our audience members talked about. That answer has to come from community. And there lies one of the biggest issues that we get into when we're having discussions like this. Like, that plan can't come from Heath and I. We can help facilitate that plan, but that plan has to be dictated and centered in community first and foremost for the folks who are most affected. We also have to understand that anti-Black racism undergirds the race construct in this country, and we know that experience exists. So we want to hold that. But what I would say is that is a hard question to answer, because if we were being honest, that question, like I said, can only be answered by community, by the folks who are most impacted. And so it requires us to listen very, very differently, right? Listen with ears that are attuned to folks and away from our needs and into the needs of community. So that's my answer. And that's the most honest answer I can give. As a community organizer, it has to be led first and foremost. That question is answered by community first and foremost.
Yeah, I think, one thing that nobody wants to hear for sure is massive wide scale redistribution.
Absolutely.
Land, resources, money, positions of power, that's a part of the dismantling, I think, as I see it. And I think that the rebuilding or the building at the same time has to happen collectively and not singularly / in a dominating capacity, that is, with anyone with the capacity to dominate over others. I'll stop there.
I appreciate that last question. That was a great question.
Yeah, that was a really good question to end on, because this is not something that we can wrap up with a neat bow, and it's a lifetime and generations and generations of work that we have ahead of us. And so I actually think that's a really appropriate note to end on, with everybody up here a little bit stumped. And so I would just like to thank our panelists so much for your time. And thank you all here in the audience, in person and virtually, for joining us in this conversation. If you do want to get involved with us, with Cure, with anybody, please be in touch with us. We're at learnwithcure.com. And we can only bring free programming like this because of generous donations from people like you. So you can do that also at learnwithcure.com if you are feeling so inclined. We also have a survey that folks on Zoom will get a link to now. I think it's in the chat and it will pop up once the Zoom session has ended. And for everybody here, you'll get an email with that. We really would appreciate it if you could fill that out, because it helps us direct where we go from here and serve the community as best as we can. And finally, this is only the third event in this series. We have 2 more coming up. The next one will be at the Larchmont Library at 2 p.m. on the March 19th. Thank you. To discuss chapter 7 of the book, which is Living Apart. And then, of course, Heather McGee herself will be joining us on March 27th. I believe the location is still at the New Rochelle Library. New Rochelle, either she will be beamed in New Rochelle or she'll be physically. Okay, we either way, we will be with her in some way in New Rochelle on the 27th. So please register for those events if you haven't and you would like to join us. And thank you so much.